Hi everyone, welcome to the SAEM Research Learning Series course online lecture titled Manuscript, Publishing Pitfalls and Pearls. As we begin today, please write down and save any questions you may have for the end of the presentation. You can either enter them into the chat box or unmute yourself during the Q&A portion of the lecture. This presentation is being recorded and will be available shortly following today's session. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Chad Kraus. Dr. Kraus is the System Director of Emergency Medicine Research for Geisinger Health System, Associate Professor for Medicine, Geisinger Commonwealth School of Medicine, and core faculty member in the Geisinger Medical Center Emergency Medicine Residency, where he was awarded the 2019 Teacher of the Year. He serves as Geisinger Site PI for several studies in the NIH SIREN network. Dr. Kraus is a member of the Geisinger IRB, the Geisinger COVID Research Oversight Group, the COVID Clinical Trials Work Group, and the Geisinger Scientific Review Committee. Dr. Kraus has been the recipient of multiple research grants and authored more than 60 peer-reviewed papers, abstracts, and book chapters on a variety of topics, including health policy, infectious disease, ethics, and education. Dr. Kraus, I will now turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, John, for your kind introduction, and thank you for everyone for joining this afternoon, and to SAEM for hosting the Research Learning Series. It's a pleasure to join all of you today. And we're going to go over today some manuscript publishing pitfalls and pearls, primarily related to open access publishing and the growth of that sort of publishing in the landscape of traditional publishing models. So a few disclosures. I have no financial disclosures related to this presentation, but do need to disclose that I'm a decision editor for the Journal of the American College of Emergency Physicians Open, which is published by Wiley Blackwell, and that's, many of you may be familiar, FACEP's new journal that was launched about a year ago as an open access journal. And then I'm also an associate editor on the editorial board of the Western Journal of Emergency Medicine, which is published via e-scholarship through the University of California, also an open access medical emergency medicine medical journal. Both of these journals are Medline indexed and on PubMed. So just to put those disclosures, both volunteer, unpaid positions. So just to give a broad overview of why we publish, hopefully we are all involved in academic emergency medicine, at least in part because it's enjoyable and professionally and personally fulfilling, hopefully as a primary reason. Obviously, it's related to our professional development, things like tenure and promotion for those involved in residency programs, helping to meet the scholarly activity requirements of the ACGME and of institutions, hopefully advance the science and of emergency medicine and advance the specialty of emergency medicine in the House of Medicine. And then hopefully our overall most important goal to publish and to produce good science is to improve patient care for those for whom we take care of, and probably when we're all patients someday for ourselves. So I think it's fair to say, and not an understatement, that we're currently publishing and working in revolutionary times, and not just because of COVID, but probably over the past decade or so, and at an increasing rate, publishing in peer-reviewed journals and scientific journals has really changed considerably. So there's been an information explosion, as we're all aware, a flood of information really in a whole series and variety of formats, including traditional journals, but things like PhoneMed, the expansion of things like Twitter, conversations on Facebook, etc., all of which have really contributed to changes in publishing and how we disseminate information. There's been also I would say, disruption and innovation in traditional models. So even the way we receive our journals has really changed. So academic emergency medicine and AEM, education and training, being two great examples of journals that we no longer receive a paper copy, but we receive a PDF copy in our email that we're then able to review. So even the way that we're receiving and consuming peer-reviewed journals has changed considerably, and probably for the good, I think. And then, as always, money is a consideration. So institutional budgets, CME allowances, and research funding in general, both locally and at the NIH level and other grant funding bodies, is always under scrutiny, but probably even more so in recent years, really where institutions and governmental agencies and other grant funding bodies are really evaluating what are we spending our money on, what is our return on investment on that money, which has made it all the more important and necessary for academic emergency physicians and researchers in general to prove the value of their work in receiving funding. And publishing really plays a considerably important role in that arena. And then finally, there's still always the traditional pressures to publish that have been a part of academic endeavors, probably really since there's been academics, which is the publish or perish sort of approach. So this is to set the stage. I think many of you have probably received these emails. And this is a colleague of mine with whom I work at Geisinger Medical Center in rural Pennsylvania, an anesthesiologist, Dr. Poehler, and I have started a bit of a internal contest to see who can collect more of these emails about open access journals and their solicitations to us. So this is one that he sent to me. And as you can see, it's a solicitation from the American Journal of Traffic and Transportation Engineering. And about halfway down the page, you can see that they want a precious paper titled Factors Affecting Electroconvulsive Therapy Ictal Outcomes. So kind of interesting that a journal of traffic and transportation engineering would be interested in what seems like a paper about seizures. And so kind of interesting to set the stage. And I think many of you hopefully have your spam filters set on high, that these go to your spam folders in your email and not to your inbox. Otherwise, you spend quite a bit of time deleting these sorts of emails. And so these are the sorts of emails that we're going to talk about a bit today as, for lack of a better term, that predatory or non-legitimate open access journals used to solicit material from authors who might be well-intentioned but unaware of the pitfalls associated with this new area of publishing. So the objectives for our talk today are going to be to review some traditional research and publication methods, not really focusing on the mechanics of how we publish, but really exploring open access publishing in the context of an open access world. We'll describe some of the open access publication methods and models, and then really discuss some pearls and pitfalls and hopefully processes for navigating open access journals and avoiding predatory publishing. And this is important, I think, for all of us as individuals, but really as we work. And I think that's why it's important to include this as part of this research learning series, is that as we mentor more junior faculty, students, fellows, et cetera, residents in research, that we really give them the tool set to be able to manage these solicitations and to understand open access publishing a little more intuitively on their own. So traditional publishing, I think we're all pretty familiar with this, where publishing costs are covered by advertisers and subscribers by and large. Again, these are general statements, but I think hold true that traditionally publishing costs have not been borne by authors. And perhaps that has shielded us as authors from understanding fully the true cost of publishing, and that publishing is really a considerable business endeavor for large publishing houses. So, all of us pay our professional society fees. Some of those fees go towards covering the cost of our professional society journals, etc. And again, we really don't see that cost because it's absorbed by our dues or absorbed by advertising revenues. So, and sometimes those fees, as I mentioned, are subsidized by our professional society. So for example, our membership fees for SAM or ACEP or AAEM, et cetera, may help to cover the costs of our access to the respective journals that are sponsored by those individual societies. Also in traditional publishing, the author usually cedes copyright or some portion of copyright to the publisher. So we all remember before everything was digital, you would be able to request reprints of your paper, and you would get a nice little packet of shiny copies of your manuscript that, as they appeared in the journal, those would be sent to you as an author, and that would be a way that you could potentially distribute or display or catalog your publications. And access is really either via subscription, so you have a username and a password because you belong to a sponsoring society, or you work in an academic institution that has a health sciences library with a large subscription service to multiple journals across specialties, etc. And the challenge with that sort of model is that unless you're in one of those situations, really accessing information, there's a bit of a firewall or a brick wall between practicing physicians and that information, and even in some cases between academic physicians and that information. So when we submit, all of us have experienced this, to a traditional journal, we sort of identify which journal we think would be a good home for our work. We submit it for peer review. That process can take quite a bit of time depending on the situation and circumstances, sometimes even up to a year, although I think most journals in electronic days have cut that considerably. And again, it's available once it's published for a fee, either as a subscriber or to buy a single paper at a cost somewhere, the $20 to $25 to $50 range for a limited time access to an individual article. So as an example, this I thought not to pick on the journal Medical Teacher, but rather to highlight as an example, I thought was interesting because it talks about the hidden agenda of predatory journals, and it's a warning call for junior authors. And as you can see, when you go, unless you have access to this journal through your institution or otherwise, when you click on this article, it asks you for $54 to have 24 hours of access, or for $655, you can purchase the entire issue in which this article appeared. So this is just one example. I think all of us have at one time or another clicked on an article of interest and met this sort of message that we needed to pay for access to the article, which for most of us means that we're probably moving on to the next bit of information rather than paying this sort of fee for a single article. And again, that's not to pick on this or any other individual journal. The cost of publishing is considerable. And again, I think we often are immune or not acutely aware of those costs. And so it's kind of shocking when we see these sorts of numbers. So again, some of the potential barriers with traditional journals that open access publishing really has attempted to address our access. And so how do we make it so that anyone with internet access can really access information in these journal articles without the cost associated with them? So without having to pay $54 for the article that I just showed you. And then another potential barrier is sometimes as an author, it can be very frustrating related to timeliness of publications and of when your articles are available. So those are really the ideas that open access journals are trying to address. So this is one definition. There's multiple definitions of open access publishing, but I think this is a nice one from the Cornell University libraries, that open access refers to freely available digital online information, and open access scholarly literature is free of charge and often carries less restrictive copyright and licensing barriers than traditional published works for both users and authors. So I think one of the important things about open access that is frequently misunderstood is open access is free of charge. That doesn't mean it's no cost. And again, I think that where the cost for publishing lies is what's unique about open access. But again, it's still costly to publish, even if it's just typesetting for PDFs. It's still a costly endeavor. So this is another simpler definition of open access publishing from Public Library of Science, PLLS, which many of you are familiar with. And their definition is really free to access, reuse, and redistribute, which I think is a nice, succinct way of describing open access publishing. So why should we even be interested in open access publishing? And we'll get to, in a few minutes, some of the potential downfalls of this, but maybe the positives of open access publishing are costs. So costs really to the end user, to the person trying to review and access an article. The costs are less than purchasing an article or owning a subscription. Similarly, access, as I noted in my introduction, access to academic journals has traditionally been limited to those individuals with either a subscription via a professional society, or if they paid for an article, or if they had access to either a university or other sort of library system in which there were subscriptions that were institutional. And a lot of that is really historical and related to sort of the way the printing press hundreds of years ago was developed, and the significant cost of printed materials back then. And some of those costs have gone down, but obviously it's still, again, a cost to someone. And so it's not that folks are trying to deny access, it's just that we're trying to make sure that the cost of doing business is met. So open access, hopefully one of the stated goals of most open access journals is to try to have more efficient turnaround. And some of that hopefully is related to, again, efficiencies in cost and production. And then probably the most important part of all of this is to summarize and say, open access is really philosophically anyway built on open exchange of information and access to science for everyone. So there are several models of open access publishing in medical journals. And again, what I'm about to describe about each of these is a general definition. There are some more nuanced points that I'm not going to go over for the purposes of this discussion, but these are really the four big models that are out there and exist. So the gold model is essentially that authors submit to an open access journal. There's sort of standard peer review process that we're all very familiar with. There's a publication fee or an article processing fee, and APC is how it might show up if the paper is ultimately accepted after the peer review process. And frequently in this model, publication fees are waived for low-income countries, or if, for example, there was an editorial that was solicited from the journal, that sort of situation, that the fees may be waived. And this gold model is probably what most people are familiar with, which is, fairly common that many of us have encountered as open access journals have grown. The green model is essentially where articles are placed in an online repository, whether that's institutionally, whether that's a discipline or specialty specific repository. Sometimes preprints of the paper itself are available prior to peer review, and so in some instances those may be even open to sort of public peer review or a broader peer review than the 2 or 3 reviewers and an editor that traditionally review a paper in traditional models. And then then postprints are usually available that are sort of an unaccepted, it, might say author copy. And really probably the best example of this type of model is really what the NIH does with funded studies, where they use PubMed Central to post these sorts of articles, and it may say author copy and it has NIH stamped around the margin. Is probably the best example of this green model. The platinum model, a little less common because of the costs, where it's free to both authors and readers. This is probably sort of, for all of us, the most ideal model, if not the least realistic. But it certainly would be wonderful if we had a model where publishing and access were both free for everyone. I'm not sure how we realistically or practically would ever achieve that. But these are really housed by an author and institution. And again, outside of the commercial mainstream, meaning that there's really not a financial transaction that takes place. And then there's a hybrid model, which I think is probably the model that we'll see more frequently going forward. And this is really where traditional journals have some open access features or some open access articles. I think we see this in very traditional journals that might have a CME article that's available widely because it's really a high impact article that we think people should have access to. It potentially gives the author the benefits of both open access and traditional journals. But again, this still costs money either for article publishing fees and or subscription fees. So what we keep coming back to for this is that publishing is expensive, and we have to find some way to pay for that, as well as to open access to the information. So this, I think, is one of the better examples of open access hybrid model, and this is Annals of Emergency Medicine's landing page when you go on the Elsevier website. And if you look, they actually have, they talk about the gold model here. So I don't know if many of us know that when you submit a paper to Annals of Emergency Medicine, you actually can select to make it open access, meaning that you wouldn't have to be a member of FACEP to have your annals access. You wouldn't have to have a library. You would have access as sort of anyone with internet capability to look at the article and access the article. And if you look at this, the subscription model versus the open access model, as you can see who the articles are available to, and then again, the open access publication fee is payable by authors or their research funder. And there's no open access publication fee if you're an author and you do the subscription model, which is the traditional approach to this. One side note that I'll make that I'm not going to get into for this discussion, but I think is an important item to consider is, and I don't know that any of us really have the answer. I'd be interested to hear what different folks are doing at their institutions, but is how open access publishing and article publishing fees will be integrated into grant writing and grant budgets going forward, and how that might change that. I think increasingly there'll be line items in grant application and in grant budgets for publication costs, which will be a whole different mechanism in order to meet the goals of this. Similarly to maybe where we would have previously had budgets for presentations or travel or those sorts of things. This may be the next line item that really becomes commonplace, not only in federal funding, but in foundation funding, et cetera. So then the final sort of open access model or method, which maybe isn't quite open access, but I think deserves mention here, is mirror journals. So these sorts of journals usually share the same editorial board, although not always. They share sort of the same aims and scope as a parent journal. Again, there's a standard peer review process. There's an open access model for fees. So usually an article processing fee or that sort of mechanism to pay the publishing costs. So one example, this isn't emergency medicine specific, but a closely related discipline, I think. So the Journal of Pediatrics, which is the main highest impact journal in pediatrics. So this is the Elsevier landing page for the Journal of Pediatrics X. And so you see here, about a third of the way down, they say the Journal of Pediatrics X is the open access mirror of the Journal of Pediatrics. So this is really the fully open access model, unlike what I just showed you on the Annals of Emergency Medicine landing page. Rather than giving an option for open access, the Journal of Pediatrics has essentially two parallel journals, one that's open access and one that's traditional. And you can see that the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Pediatrics X is actually the same editor-in-chief as the Journal of Pediatrics. And one of the items on this page that I think is interesting is that they highlight how fast their time to first decision is. So 2.4 weeks, which again, they're trying to take advantage of the long process that sometimes occurs in getting a paper into a regular traditional journal. So again, this is another sort of next level page, but you can see they have the Journal of Pediatrics and then their featured partner journal, which is the Journal of Pediatrics X again. So certainly doing advertising to encourage people to submit to the mirror journal of the same professional society. So is this just a sort of a fad, or is open access publishing really gaining momentum? I think we all know the answer to whether or not it's gaining momentum, and there's probably very good and positive reasons for that, and perhaps some more nefarious reasons that that's happening. Will this be the future of publishing? As I mentioned, what's this going to mean for funded projects? And probably more importantly, what might this mean for projects that aren't funded? So those projects that we all do in our departments, whether we're mentoring residents or fellows or students, that might be a small summer project or other projects that don't have grant funding, where are we going to come up with the article processing fees for those types of projects? It's certainly very, very difficult in the current situation and setting for any of us to go to a department chair, to our hospital or health system leadership and say, hey, I'd really like to have a line item budget for $5,000 or $10,000 or $15,000 as sort of my publication fund for the next year for all the projects that don't have external funding so that I can get those published. That is certainly a challenge and a very real challenge. And then finally, what about indexing? So I put on here, what about PubMed ID? But really, what about indexing sort of across the spectrum of scientific journals and bibliometrics and which publication services and indexing services they belong to? Because as we all know, for many of us still the holy grail is to have our PubMed ID papers for, again, promotion, scholarly activity, etc. So this was an article in the BMC Medicine, which is one of the open access journals. And this was actually several years ago, sort of at the outset of the big explosion of open access. And it's a little small, but on the bottom, if you look, essentially what they compared in this study was 2-year impact factors. And we certainly can all argue about the value or not of impact factors as a bibliometric and whether or not that's, the best way to evaluate something, the impact of science. But I think it's still a regarded method of looking at scientific impact and scope. And they looked at that as a metric. That's what they used as their outcome. And this, again, was 8 or 9 years ago at this point. And they essentially said that open access journals that are indexed in Web of Science and or Scopus, again, 2 indexing services, are approaching the same scientific impact and quality as subscription journals. And particularly they noted in biomedicine and those journals funded by article processing charges or article processing fees, et cetera. So this was sort of an initial stab at this to say, you know, is open access sort of scientifically non-inferior to traditional publishing methods in impact? This again was very, very early on. So this was about 15 years ago when I think the very, very, very first open access journals started to come out. And Stanford University, this was a statement by their faculty senate regarding journals that were beginning to show exploitation in article processing fees, in solicitations, et cetera. And so this was a statement made by the Stanford University Faculty Senate back in 2004 that they recommended that faculty not contribute to journal articles or editorials or review efforts to publishers and or journals that engage in exploitive or exorbitant pricing. So even back then, we were starting to see potentially some of the downsides of open access publishing. Probably even a bigger noteworthy event happened about a year and a half ago when the University of California system terminated its subscription and its agreements with Elsevier due to open access argument or disagreement in their negotiations. And why this was so significant is if you look in the second paragraph of this, is that the University of California faculty produce about 10% of all the publishing output in the United States, which is absolutely incredible. While it includes multiple large universities, that's really pretty incredible that there's that level of research output and publication output. And essentially, you know, this came down to wanting the University of California wanting to really make all of their faculty research sort of widely available and again open to the end user, not behind a firewall, not behind a subscription. And so this, I think, is really big news. At the time, it was really big news. I think it's still a developing story. How this will impact what other large universities, health systems, et cetera, do going forward. I want to share this video about that sort of the university approach, I think, from Stanford and from the University of California. There are multiple other examples of this changing milieu, but I think this is from 7 or 8 years ago, talking about the NIH and open access. And this is just a short video that hopefully will help to frame what the federal government's approach and philosophy about this is, particularly the NIH.
Hello, everyone. I'm Francis Collins. I'm the director of the National Institutes of Health, and I'm delighted to be here with Jack Andreka.
So I'm Jack Andreka. I'm a sophomore, and I won the Intel International Science and Engineering Fair.
So how did you come up with a project, and what was that project?
Essentially, what I've created was a new way to detect pancreatic, ovarian, and lung cancer that costs 3 cents and it takes 5 minutes to run. And it's 100% accurate so far in clinical studies. And then also, it can detect the cancer in the earliest stages when someone has close to 100% chance of survival.
Clearly, you had to do a lot of searching then through science, what people had worked on, what experiments they'd done, what publications were there. So you were sitting at your computer, or were you going to a library? How did you get access?
How I got access was with Google. Essentially, I would just Google like some keywords and go to a publication. And then sometimes it wasn't really about the content of the publication, it's more about the references in it.
Yeah.
And then I would look at all of those and look through those. But that was actually really hard because I hit a lot of paywalls. Like you have to pay $40 per article. And unfortunately, I couldn't like shell out a lot of that. So instead, I would have to like kind of cheat and copy the article title back into Google and then look for PDF versions. And a lot of the times I actually found them on the NIH PubMed site.
So you used PubMed a fair amount.
Oh yes, I spent hours on PubMed.
Were there some things you couldn't even get to even with your workaround? Were there things that weren't in PubMed?
Oh yeah, for sure. There's a lot of articles that the abstracts weren't even published for. And so what would be a lot better is if we would be able to have all of these access. And that's really important because I'm not a unique case. There are millions of people like me.
Yes.
And so if you can just go on Google and Wikipedia and find these amazing articles, we could have this great innovation, but these paywalls are stopping us.
I agree with you. So NIH has tried to sort of take a lead in this situation. And now I gather PubMed gets about 830,000 people hitting on it every day and downloading from PubMed about 1.6 million articles, not just the abstract, but the whole article,
Wow.
telling you how much interest there is out there to use this information. At the moment, we have a deal that anybody who's funded by NIH who publishes a paper, that paper has to be available in 12 months. So that anybody can see it. I think the goal we all want to see is that this is really purely open access. There are some challenges in getting there, and not everybody agrees about this. Not every funding agency across the world has followed our lead, but it's making such a difference.
So what do you think about Obama's new executive order on open access?
I think it's great. I think the president, by making this a real priority at the highest level of the administration, is saying this matters. He's very much into science, our president. Clearly, if anybody cares about science, the idea of having open access is going to be crucial to the future. So for him to say, okay, this needs to be done across government, not just here and there, is a very signal moment. This is basically crowdsourcing science. And that's a really powerful concept. The idea that we can make progress in sort of a closed shop. Yeah, we make progress that way, but to open that up to the vastness of human creativity and inspiration by open access, that's how we're going to really turbocharge this effort to come up with answers.
So open access is kind of like opening the playing field from only like maybe a few 100,000 people to millions and millions of people on this to do the research.
Essentially, maybe even billions, maybe the whole world.
That's super exciting.
So I think that interview is really great, and it's as noted because it was they mentioned President Obama. That was from, I want to say 2013 or 2014, but I think some of the quotes in that and in the overall philosophy and tone and sense of that is this idea of crowdsourcing science. And I think we've seen in COVID times. When I initially was approached about this presentation, it was COVID had not reared its head yet. But I think as we've seen with the explosion of science and studies during COVID, that this crowdsourcing and this sort of real-time peer review is sticky work, is dirty work, but hopefully is work that allows us to make the end product better and cleaner and more available. And so this is on the NIH website, their public access policy that Francis Collins just outlined regarding how the NIH views this. But as he noted, that's not sort of 100% consistent across the world or across all funding agencies. So is open access too good to be true? Is it simply just paying to publish? Am I just paying a fee and getting my paper published, or is it something else? So all of you may have heard these sorts of stories where this was one in the British Medical Journal reporting about a spoof medical paper full of detectable flaws was submitted in a sting operation to 304 open access journals and was accepted by more than half of those journals. The papers were actually never published. They were retracted by the folks who undertook the sting operation. But it does go to show you how there is, again, maybe a darker side of this potentially positive development. This was another story about an editor-in-chief that resigned over a fake manuscript that essentially was generated by a computerized product. Computerized software. So again, this is the downside potentially of open access. So what are these sorts of predatory journals or these pseudo journals? There's many terms for them. I think predatory is what most people have heard. These journals really have questionable marketing practices. They have suspect peer review processes. They have ghost reviewers or editorial board members. So not only is the peer review process sometimes suspect, but may not even be the true peer review process that we're all familiar with and trust. So the dangers of that clearly are for those individuals who who fall prey to these sorts of journals is they could, potentially lose their professional reputation. Certainly an embarrassment to submit to one of these journals and have your work appear in one of them. I think for all of us, it results in a loss of confidence in science. And I think that's the big public risk of this, is that the public loses confidence in the science we're doing. I think there's, potentially the loss of a reliance on peer review processes if people think they can submit something and rapidly get it turned around and accepted. And then I think there's a loss of trust in these potential new models of publishing that are hopefully disruptive and innovative in a positive way, to, again, help us to have better access, to give people venues to publish their work, and to have a space in which we can speak about and talk about and review science, and again, advance the specialty and improve patient care. So there are some standards that have been established, I think, that we all know about from Publishing 101, the World Association of Medical Editors, the COPE, the ICMJE, and then there's also this directory of open access journals, which I think is very helpful and a really good tool, particularly for those we may mentor in this arena. So how do we maintain high ethical standards and wade through this brave new world? So paying a fee to publish a paper is acceptable. It's not pay to play. It is a different model of where the cost is shifted in publication, but it is not unethical to pay a publishing fee. If there's unreasonably fast turnaround of a paper, so if someone says, it's Tuesday, I can get this paper published for you by Friday, certainly that's a red flag that I think most of us would know, but perhaps not universally. If there's guaranteed acceptance, I think that's a red flag. Even in cases of invited editorials, it's certainly not guaranteed acceptance, and those certainly go through a level of peer review. If there's not an editorial board identified, or if it's a group of people who aren't established or whose names you don't recognize, those are all certainly red flags for the ethics of the journal. These are just some tips that was a paper that I was part of last year in Academic Medicine about open access journals, and some of the ways that you can identify legitimate open access journals. So is it a journal that's had articles in it that you've read before? If the publisher sent you, again, one of those unsolicited emails like I showed you at the beginning, a transportation journal soliciting papers about seizures, etc. Those sorts of spam emails are probably the biggest red flag of this whole arena. And frequently they'll do plays on the titles that we all know and just change a word or two, and it sounds like a legitimate journal, when in fact it is not. If the publisher has contact information on the website, that's probably more likely that it's a legitimate journal. Is there information for contacting the editorial office? Are they asking you for a submission fee versus a publication fee? So are they asking for $1,000, for example, to even review the paper? That probably is a big red flag versus asking you for an article processing fee once it's accepted. And then can you easily find the papers that the journals publish? So again, indexing helps with that, but even before some of these journals have been indexed, there still may be good quality work. They're just not found in one of those indexing services. So I think we're all familiar with Beall's List. This was a gentleman who is a faculty member at the University of Colorado, who had started this online blog about a decade ago called Beall's List, where he did his best, I think, to identify predatory journals. He mistakenly misidentified some legitimate journals, and Beall's List basically disappeared in 2017 after some litigation and lawsuits. So there are still some potential quote unquote white lists, although I don't really love that term, that sort of try to help us to sort out what might be a legitimate journal versus not. So this is one example, Cable's List. Again, you can see the website, and they actually, you can search by name. This is a subscription service, and you can see this is actually endorsed with a testimonial by Dr. Beal. Probably a more robust and again, open access / free way to look for journals is this directory of open access journals. And this website is really nice. They're working on relaunching it any day now in a new format. But this is really a nice, a large database that is easily searchable. So again, I pulled up sort of the two big open access journals that many of us are familiar with in emergency medicine, and the two that I'm on the editorial boards for. So this is what it looks like if you search for the Western Journal of Emergency Medicine. It'll tell you that it's peer reviewed. It'll give you the subjects, when it was added to this list. It tells you the article processing fee. And then I'll show you, this is, if you were to click on that, this is JSEP Open, but sort of the next level down in the website is they show you the article processing fees. They tell you who the publisher is, etc. And so this is really, they give you a lot of information. You can look at the editorial board, etc. And this is a really nice tool, again, for more junior and experienced authors, but also for us and those of us who mentor more junior folks. So a few take-home points. I think this publishing landscape is changing rapidly. I only scratched the surface in this last 50 minutes or so. And I think it's going to continue to change in the next 5 to 10 years, perhaps even more rapidly. I think all of these models are appropriate and are options. I think we're in a world where it's not going to be open access or traditional or hybrid. I think we're in a situation that's really an and model, where it's open access and traditional and hybrid, and maybe models that we're really unaware of and that aren't available to us quite yet. But I think the big reminder of all this is that's a little bit different than maybe a decade or 2 decades ago, is that open access really comes with a new need for diligence by authors, by institutions, and really by disciplines. As an emergency medicine community, we really need to have a diligence for this to discuss, to help one another out, and to really guide and mentor those, not only our colleagues, but those whom we teach. This is my email, just my name @gmail.com. I'm more than happy to discuss offline. I'm happy to take questions now as well. But certainly, if you have thoughts or feedback or experiences, I'd love to hear those. I've been collecting these from colleagues in emergency medicine and otherwise, because I think it's really an interesting area. So with that, I'll stop talking and take questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Kraus, for this very informative presentation. I would like to open the discussion now for Q&A at this time. As a reminder, you can enter your questions in the chat box or unmute yourself and ask your question at this time. And Dr. Kraus, we'll just give it a couple of minutes and see if any questions populate.
Absolutely. And again, I'm certainly willing to take questions, comments offline as well, if no one has anything here.
And we'll just give it a couple of more seconds.
Thanks, Sean. Thank you for attending. I appreciate it.
So it sounds like you covered everything fairly well.
Well, thank you again for having me. It was my pleasure, and you have a great day.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kraus, for this excellent presentation. Thank you to everyone who was able to attend, and have a great day.
Take care.